Welcome to the Wannabe Theologian podcast. I'm Paul Hess. I'm grateful you've tuned in today. You can find the podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Anchor FM, and Apple Podcasts. Just make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast to stay tuned for the latest episode releases. Normally, with in these episodes, I do some topic dealing with the doctrine of God, but today I want to do something slightly different. And I wanted to just briefly do a short episode on why I started this podcast in the first place. There are plenty of podcasts out there, and so the question is obviously, why another one? Well, there are other good podcasts out there, like the Particular Baptist podcast, Mortification of Spin, the Baptist broadcast, Doctrine and Devotion, Regenerate Radio. Uh, all these are good in each in their own way, but this podcast, the Wannabe Theologian podcast, is the only one that I'm aware of that is dedicated to just discussing the doctrine of God. All these other podcasts are good, each in their own way, and there's a lot of value to them, but they cover a broader variety of topics. And I wanted to keep to one that was very focused on doctrine of God. This is not meant to be a current events type of podcast, but rather I want the content to be fairly evergreen. And basically where this is meant to be a free resource to aid Christians in articulating a biblically sound, confessionally based doctrine of God. So, where did this podcast come from? So, this all got started late last year. I was leading a Wednesday evening Bible study at my church, and that study was focused on the various attributes of God. It's a topic I already loved, and it just sparked my interest in it even more, gave me a deeper love for the doctrine of God, and it sparked a desire in me to help better equip believers in their knowledge of God, in His attributes, in their knowledge of the Trinity, and so on. Um, and over time, my love of this topic has grown immensely, and I wanted to be able to share what I've learned with others. As I mentioned in the first episode 1, I currently am a Master's of Divinity student at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, but I do desire to go into more work, into doctoral work in the area of doctrine of God. Where exactly that'll be, I don't know yet. I need to first finish the Master's of Divinity degree, but I do desire to go into that some more. So, but beyond that, I've begun to realize that there's more of a pressing need for a podcast like this. It's focused on the doctrine of God. Over the past few years, and especially in the last few months, I've begun to observe that many evangelical Christians, even Reformed Christians, of whom I'm one, there's been this decline in a robust doctrine of God. And there have been certain debates that have begun to arise and accelerate that represent departures from longstanding Christian beliefs about God. It's not necessarily that these departures are heretical, but they are nonetheless departures from longstanding Christian beliefs about God. And the reason this is important is that some of the most serious debates within the church, especially in the early church, the first few hundred years after Christ, those debates centered on the doctrine of God and the doctrine of Jesus. And as a result of those debates, as a result of dealing with heretics, the Christians have had to develop a robust doctrine of God. That's what those heresies, like the Gnostics or the Arians, they forced Christians to develop a robust view of God, a robust view of Christ. And in our modern era, we're starting to lose that again. Something that's been robust and widely accepted in Christianity for centuries has begun to get lost in the past few hundred years. And certain more serious errors are starting to show their face again. I'm not going to go into details, but some of the early Christian heresies are starting to show their face again in some pernicious ways. And so my desire here is not necessarily to take those on head to head, but do my part to help be a voice for a biblical doctrine of God and help grow believers in their understanding of the Christian doctrine of God as articulated by Christians throughout the ages in various confessions and creeds. Now, you may or may not be as interested in this subject as I am. Again, I'm very interested in the doctrine of God. Not everyone may share that interest. Maybe you're interested in eschatology, the study of end times, or maybe you're very interested in covenant theology and learning how the Bible's storyline fits together. Maybe you're interested in and how the Bible speaks to political theory, or how it speaks to economics, how it speaks to your marriage. There's a whole litany of things that you may be interested in, and that's wonderful and great. There are many things we can learn from the Bible, and in many areas we can delve deep and really get to grips with the depth of what the Bible has to speak. But underpinning all of that is our view of God. And a proper view of God is vital for the rest of our theology. It affects all aspects. It's not always obvious, but it is there. And if you want to have a sound view of eschatology, study of end times, if you want to have a good view of how what the Bible says about marriage and so on, having a sound doctrine of God is very important in underpinning that. And as a result, even though what we talk about in the doctrine of God may seem rather esoteric or academic, it is ultimately highly practical because our theology determines how we live. And our doctrine of God ends up infiltrating into all these other aspects that are highly practical in our lives. So, with that in mind, brings us to the last thing I want to hit on is who is this podcast targeted for? Like, what is the target audience of this podcast? And by and large, my goal is just to reach any Christian who desires to learn more of God. It can be a layperson, it can be a pastor, it can be a seminary president. It doesn't matter. My goal is to help Christians grow more in their knowledge of God. A more specific audience I have in mind is my local church. I am currently a member and a deacon at my local church, which is Breathe Reformed Baptist Church. But again, this podcast is not a ministry of our church. This is just my own personal project. I want to make that clear. But that is my target audience, more specifically, are my fellow members at Breathe Reformed Baptist Church. As we go through this podcast, I'm not expecting any special education. I want to make sure that I'm not making it such that you feel like I'm that you have to be a seminary student in order to understand. I want to make this as accessible as I possibly can because this is something that's meant for everybody. The doctrine of God is not merely for the professor at the seminary, it's meant for everybody. And that's my goal here, is to articulate things in a way that is very accessible and present things in a way that is roughly analogous to if you went to a Bible college and were getting an undergraduate degree in Bible at some sort of Bible college. That's ultimately what I'm trying to do with this podcast. So hopefully that helps get some of the background behind this podcast, why I'm doing this, who it's targeted to, what the motivation was. So if you found this podcast helpful, like and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite streaming service. If you do so, that helps the podcast tremendously. And as always, thank you again for listening. God bless.